quite a moving poem because it's written from the point of view of a mother who has lost her son to the war. It isn't made clear which war, although Jane Weir has said that she was thinking about mothers from World War One, but it really is quite a universal poem in that it could apply just as well to the present day. Soldiers not returning from Afghanistan.
I think lots of people get a little bit confused when they're reading this poem, and I think that's partly because she seems to move around within her memories. There's shifts in time, and she sort of flips between remembering her son as a young boy going off to school and then remembering him as a young man going off to join the army and going off to war. And sometimes that can be a little bit confusing. But I think that the theme that runs all the way through the poem is one of grief and one of a sense of loss.
And I think it captures the grief so well, and part of it is that confusion, that her memories are all sort of intermingling. She's remembering her son as perhaps the last time she saw him, sending him off to war, smartly dressed in his uniform, and that's bringing back memories of him as a child. And I think it's probably impossible to try and break this up into neat little sections where this section's about him as a child and this section's about him as an adult, because it is all intermingling in the mind, and I think that's why and how it conveys grief so convincingly.
Right, well, if we're looking at the language of the poem, perhaps we should start off by looking at the language she uses to describe her son and their relationship. She talks about the sort of clothes he wears, but very much of him as the sort of schoolboy. She talks about playing at being Eskimos like we did when you were little, which is this very sort of sweet and cute image of an adult and child rubbing noses. But then in the same stanza, in stanza 2, she talks about resisting the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. And I think the description of his hair, you know, obviously as a teenager, as a young adult, he's taking more care over his appearance. But the black thorns, the sort of sense of sharpness or danger possibly within that he might then face later on.
Yeah, that's an example of the child and the adult merging together, and it's quite difficult to separate sometimes. I think it kind of emphasises the fact as well that from the mother's perspective, he will always be her little boy, and that however tall and smart he's become, she still feels the same way about him, which I think is what makes it quite touching. The other thing about language is when you read what Jane Weir herself has written about this poem and about her other poetry, she's fascinated by textiles and fabrics, and I think there's a lot of imagery connected to that runs through this poem. There's lots of references to fabrics. I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, you've got an idea of the texture there. Yellow bias binding, the detail around his blazer. Smooth down, which gives a sense of sort of smooth fabric. And these ideas, these metaphors, and these patterns of language run throughout the poem. And I think it gives a very sort of sensory feel to the poem, and you've got this sense of the mother not wanting to let go of her son because she's remembering all the times that she's touched him and how he felt.
And then in stanza 3 towards the end, she talks about her stomach as she's making her way to the churchyard, talking about making tucks, darts, pleats, sort of stitching or sewing, you know, just describe the kind of inner turmoil or tension that she's going through. And then stanza 4, the dove becomes an ornamental stitch. I suppose, you know, students want to know why she might have done that, and maybe part of the reason is because sewing and fabrics and clothing the child is such a kind of traditional thing for a mother to do in particular. They're always, you know, keeping the first pair of baby shoes or baby clothes just as a memento or a keepsake of when their children were very young.
I think it also as well gives a sense of some sort of applique collage or tapestry that's being created, this picture of her memories as well.
So stitching her memories together into the poem.
I think so, yes.
Some of the metaphorical language a little bit later on, where she talks about birds and birds suddenly start appearing in the poem. Releasing a songbird from its cage she uses to describe perhaps the way she believes she's set her son free. He talks, she says he was away intoxicated with the kind of excitement and enthusiasm. She feels that she's kind of released him. But then we have the references to the doves, which I suppose is supposed to bring to mind the idea of peace within the poem, but I don't know that she really feels at peace.
No, but I think it does seem to link more with this idea of freedom, doesn't it? I mean, the boy all the way through, even as a small child, probably is trying to get away from his mother, as children do, and her urge is to hold on to him and touch him and keep him close. She knows she's had to let him go, and then she's got to deal with the grief of now having let him go, he's not going to come back.
So there's a simile in the fourth stanza. She leans against the war memorial like a wishbone. I think it's really clear what she's wishing for there, wishing for him to return. And then that really emotive final line, your playground voice catching on the wind. So it's the memories of him as a young boy, they're the things that she holds on to most.
She's holding on to them, but the fact that it's on the wind as well suggests that it could so easily, it could easily fade away, and that it's quite hard to grasp hold of. All this sensory imagery all the way through of touching things and feeling things and remembering the solid feel of him, and suddenly at the end it's kind of become very ephemeral and could easily disappear.
So it's almost like she's trying to make her memories much more concrete, almost as a replacement or a surrogate for her son, and yet she can't. She can't because he's gone. In terms of structure on the surface, I think that Poppies appears to be a sort of narrative. In the first stanza she gives it a very clear kind of setting, or at least what we think might be a clear setting, 3 days before Armistice Sunday. And then as you read through the poem, you sort of realise that, well, actually, this was in the past, this 3 days before. So it's not as easy to say stanza 1 is about this, stanza 2 is about this, stanza 3 is about this. Certainly, as you move through the poem, there is the mixing up of the memories, but it has a more definite ending, I think, ending at the war memorial.
It's back at the war memorial, yeah. And I think it's unnecessary to try and find a very rigid structure to it in terms of the chronology of when things have happened, because the whole point of it is that she has all these memories floating around in her head and she's trying to pin them down, and she's going backwards and forwards between the recent past and the distant past. So I don't think it's important to actually try and identify exactly when each bit happened.
And the sort of fluidity of the structure is kind of emphasised by the use of enjambment. So we do have a lot of lines that run into each other. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like you did when you were little. So it's sort of a bit disjointed, very fluid like her memories, and it can be quite disconcerting to read, I suppose.
And I think, as well as that, the caesura in the middle of the lines quite often adds to that sense of being fragmented or disjointed. You get that in the third line on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel. We're not quite sure whether those two halves are talking about the same time period.
So there is some deliberate trying to confuse the reader, maybe. Just to, I suppose, bring to mind the confusion, the loss that the mother feels. There are some end-stop lines that really do have impact. A split second and you were away intoxicated. Yeah. And then we shift to after you'd gone. So as well as the enjambment in the midline caesura, then we have those very definite end-stop lines. You know, and it's interesting that it's the end-stop line comes when he has left. That's it.
You get a sense of his excitement, then the door closing, and then the silence
of her in his bedroom. So, in terms of personal response, how does Poppies make you feel as a reader?
I think because I'm reading it as a mother, you know, and as the mother of a son, I identify with it very strongly. The memories of the child at a very early age needing your attention, and then as the child gets older, wanting to be away and wanting the cuddles and the, you know, the touching less, and just being aware of letting your child go. And I think it's a very universal poem, because although it's obviously about war, it's not about any particular war, and it could just be about letting your child go as well.
I think that it should make young people think as well, perhaps, about the people they leave behind as they set off on their lives. So yes, going to college is very exciting, going on your first foreign holiday is really exciting, going off to university is really exciting, you know, you're starting your own family. All these are wonderful moments for the person doing it, but by the flip side of that must be that there is always going to be somebody left behind and feeling regret. And I think for parents it can be very difficult, particularly within this poem where he is going off to what will be his death. For parents it can be really, really difficult to sort of cut the strings and allow them to go.
When we're comparing this poem to other poems from the cluster, the first one that springs to mind for me is Futility, because I'm aware that Wilfred Owen put this poem Futility in a group of poems that he entitled Grief, and it is very much about personal grief rather than the conflict itself. And obviously Poppies is about a mother's grief, so I think it's very much a similar poem from that point of view. Futility is written from the point of view of a soldier, or maybe a group of soldiers, looking at a companion who's died from exposure in the night. It's a very tender poem, it's a very gentle poem. It sort of ignores all the conflict and all the horror of war and just concentrates on the grief of losing a companion. And Poppies obviously is very much a study in grief from a mother's point of view.
I think I would choose to compare it to The Falling Leaves, again for the same reasons, that it's not a poem immediately about conflict or fighting or soldiers. It's a poem about the effects or after effects. So The Falling Leaves by Margaret Postgate Cole, it's again a woman's perspective on war, and as she travels one day past the trees, she sees the leaves and they sort of make her think of all the millions of soldiers dying during World War I.
And I think if we're looking at, you know, if we're comparing it on the basis of point of view, or perspective, you could compare it to Out of the Blue. It's a very different poem, obviously, but Out of the Blue is written from the perspective, the imagined perspective of somebody who's at the top of one of the World Trade Center towers on 9/11, and Simon Armitage is imagining that person's thoughts and feelings, and it's very much speculative, and just based on on the images that were seen and taken on that day. I find, from a personal point of view, that Poppies is more successful because it seems to be written perhaps from more personal experience, certainly from the experience of somebody who was a mother, and it seems to capture the emotions of the person more convincingly.